All right. By my clock, it is 5:04 p.m., and so we've got a good crowd. So I'm glad to and excited to be welcoming today Michael Morell, the former Deputy Director of the CIA, oftentimes Acting Director of the CIA, to be here with us, and one of my colleagues at Beacon Global Strategies. So thanks, Mike, for being here. Really appreciate it. It's great to have you here. So folks, today we're going to have a conversation about a variety of things, including in particular what the next president, whoever it might be, has in store for them, and the way that Mike sees the world, and the potential threats that are coming at the next president of the United States. With that, let me just give a little bit of your background, Mike, and then we'll just jump right in.
Sure.
You obviously served as Deputy Director of the CIA, twice as Acting Director. You had over 30 years at the agency. You played a central role in the U.S. fight against terrorism, efforts to halt the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, efforts to respond to trends that change the international landscape, much as COVID-19 is, the Arab Spring, the rise of China, the cyber threat. You were one of the leaders in the search for Osama bin Laden and participated in the lead up to the debate around bin Laden in May 2011. You started your career at CIA in 1980, working East Asia issues for over a decade and a half almost. You were the director of the Office of Asia Pacific and Latin American Analysis. You had assignments that ranged from the DI, being the top analyst of the DI, being the executive director of the agency, and you were also President Bush's intelligence briefer and EA to Director Tenet. Today, you obviously host Intelligence Matters, an amazing podcast.
Thanks.
And you serve as senior counsel at Beacon Global. But I want to take us back to your service as the briefer, the PDB briefer to President Bush. You were with him on 9/11, right? Tell us about that moment, if you would.
Yeah. So that entire day is seared into my memory. Literally every second of that day. But if I were going to summarize it, I'd say that it was a mixture of the intensity of doing my job with the surreal. So an example of the intensity of doing my job, as we were flying over the Gulf of Mexico, not sure exactly where we were going to go, knowing we couldn't go back to Washington, but not knowing where we should go. The president asked to see me in his rather small office on Air Force One. So it was the president, it was me, and it was his chief of staff, Andy Card. And the president looked at me and he said, "Michael, who did this?" And we didn't know at that moment who was responsible. So I said, "Mr. President, I haven't seen any intelligence yet that would take us to a perpetrator, but so you're going to get my best. You're going to get my best estimate, right?" And he said, "I understand the caveat. Now move on." And so I told him, Mr. President, one might immediately think of a nation state, right? And one might think of Iran and Iraq. And let me tell you that I think that neither one of them has anything to gain, and both of them have everything to lose from doing something like this. So I don't think it was a nation state. I think when we get to the end of the road here, we're going to find Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. And I told him that I would bet my children's future on that. I've never told them that.
Good to know.
He then looked me in the eye and said, "When will we know?" Which
Right.
is the kind of question you get from a president.
Yeah.
And so I drew back on one of the skills of being an analyst, which is to provide context. So I reminded him of all the previous attacks on the United States and how long it took us to know. So I said, East Africa bombings, 2 days to know that it was Al-Qaeda.
Right.
The bombing of the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen, it took us 3 months to figure out it was Al-Qaeda.
Right.
And then the bombing of Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, it took us a year to figure out that trail went back to Iran. So I said, "Mr. President, we may know soon, and then again, it may take some time."
Yeah.
That was an example of the intensity of doing my job. Later that night, CIA sent me a piece of intelligence that a European government had given to us. The sourcing wasn't clear. You didn't know what the credibility was, but the message was crystal clear. The message was, what happened today was the first of 2 waves of attack on the homeland.
Wow.
So you can imagine my having to tell the president that news.
Right.
So that's an example of the intensity of doing my job. An example of the surreal is as we were on final approach to Andrews, the president's military aide, the guy who carries the nuclear football, was looking out the windows on the left side of the aircraft, and he and I had become friends over the previous 9 months, and he saw me looking at him and he waved me over. And so I went over to the window and I looked out, and there was an F-16 on the wingtip. And he said, they're from the DC Air National Guard. There's another one on the other wingtip. And they were so close that you could see the pilot, you could see the pilot's facial features, and you could see the pilot looking at us. And in the distance, you could see the still burning Pentagon. And then he said something to me that I'll never forget, and that sent shivers up my spine, and still does to this day when I tell this story. He said, "Do you know why they're there?" I had no idea. I'm not a military guy. So I said, "No." And he said, "They're there in case somebody fires a surface-to-air missile at Air Force One on final approach. Their job will be to put themselves between that missile and the president."
Right. It's crazy. It's amazing. I mean, look, it gives me chills up my spine. Yeah, just thinking about 9/11 to this day. I know there's a lot of folks, some of the students from George Mason who are online who grew up after that period and don't have a memory of it. It's amazing to me now, but that moment changed America in fundamental ways. And in a lot of ways, I think we've forgotten a lot of those lessons. Today we feel relatively safe. We've been safe for the better part of almost 20 years, and yet, I think people forget that the reason we've been this safe, right, is that we've fought those wars overseas for the better part of 20 years. There's a lot of talk about, bringing our troops home from Iraq, bringing our troops home from Afghanistan. But part of the reason, I think, is it fair to say that part of the reason that we have been so safe at home is because we've taken the fight to Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. I mean, we've kept our capabilities out there, both CIA and our military. Is that a fair statement? Is that
No, that's absolutely right. And, there are two pieces to the fact that until Pensacola, right, I used to be able to say this, but until Pensacola a couple of months ago, there had not been a foreign directed terrorist attack on the homeland. And that is not despite the enemy trying. And there were two reasons why they didn't succeed. One reason were the defensive steps that we took. Tightening up immigration, tightening up airline security, tightening up cockpit doors. There's a long list of those defensive kinds of things. Yeah. And then there's taking the fight to the enemy, right? And degrading them wherever you can find them. And if you can put pressure on them, and you need both intelligence capabilities and military capabilities to do that. If you can put pressure on them, it makes their job of attacking us much more difficult. So I think it's both of those things together that have kept us safe.
Yeah, and part of the defensive measures, right, are our ability to conduct surveillance and identify threats overseas. And of course, right now, today, for the last 4.5 months, we have been without the surveillance authorities that were authorized in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And we've seen, sort of a lack of leadership in the House and the Senate. The president, it's unclear what he thinks about FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, because of his concerns about surveillance against the campaign. I mean, it's astounding, right? The idea that we would be without those authorities for this long, and remain in that state. We are in pre-9/11 version of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in large part.
Right. And people don't realize, right, that that foreign nationals, when they are inside the United States, have protection of the Constitution, right? So if I want to spy on a foreign diplomat, right, say a Russian or a Chinese or somebody at the North Korean mission in New York or the Iranian mission in New York, I got to get a court order. I got to get a court order to spy on them, right? Same is true of a terrorist. So if I'm spying on a terrorist and that person all of a sudden steps in the United States, I have to stop spying until I get that FISA court order to continue spying, right? So people don't understand that.
Right. It is amazing. So, what I think is interesting about this, though, we talk about the threat posed by terrorism. We know about the threats posed by Iran, North Korea, China, Russia. You recently wrote a piece in the Washington Post where you said that if Vice President Biden were to become the president in January 2021, he would inherit a world that was arguably more dangerous than it's ever been in a century. And that's kind of amazing to, people like you and me that grew up through 9/11, that grew up during the Cold War with the threat of nuclear war with the Russians. how is that possible? What are these threats that Vice President Biden, if he were to become the president, or frankly, President Trump, if he remains the president,
Right.
what are they going to see in January 2021 coming at him, and why, and how do we get here?
Yeah. So this was an op-ed that I wrote with my good friend and former colleague Mike Vickers, and what we were thinking was not just the national security challenges, but the whole plate, right, that the president would face. And we actually went back, through every president and talked about, okay, what did they face on Inauguration Day? And the closest we could get was FDR. So when FDR took office in 1933, he faced the Great Depression.
Right.
He faced calls for radical political and economic change at home, and he faced the rise of a fascist Germany and a fascist Japan, right?
Right.
And so we said to ourselves, okay, what is Vice President Biden going to face, or a Donald Trump in a second term, right?
Right.
The most significant pandemic in 100 years, a severe economic recession, if not a depression, right? That is going to last quite some time. And by the way, that pandemic is going to last quite some time too. The greatest political divisions we've seen at home, at least since the 1960s, if not before.
Right.
And all of the underlying causes of those,
right.
whether it's income inequality or systemic racism or what have you, right?
Right.
Climate change, right, which could be the biggest threat to all of us at the end of the day. So you have all of those issues, and then pile on top of that the national security environment. And I would argue that the national security environment is much more dangerous today than it was when Vice President Biden left office in January of 2017. And the most significant on that list is China, right? How the U.S.-China relationship evolves over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years is really going to define what the world is going to look like, right? And whether we end up in two camps, right, with groups of countries orbiting around China and groups of countries orbiting around us, or whether we end up in a better world, right?
Yeah.
And there's a continuum. There's a continuum on that potential relationship that ranges from cooperation at one end of the spectrum, the kind of cooperation you saw between Barack Obama and Xi Jinping on climate change during Barack Obama's last year. So what I would call healthy competition on both the economic front and the diplomatic front, to unhealthy competition, and we have got our share of that at the moment, all the way to conflict and war at the other end of the spectrum, right? So that is a huge challenge facing the next commander-in-chief, because time is actually running out in figuring out how to deal with China over the long term. And so that issue is facing us. And then also facing us is this issue of Russia, right? Where Putin has figured out a weapon much more powerful than anything Russia has ever had, which is information operations. And using that to divide us and weaken us. And we couldn't do that unless we are already divided, right? He's not creating those divisions, he's widening them.
Right.
So we've got that problem, and how do we deal with that, And then we've got North Korea, which, despite the president's efforts, and I actually applaud him for trying something new, because nothing else that any president did before had any positive impact. But we face a more dangerous North Korea today than we did in January of 2017. Despite the fact that they've held off on nuclear tests and long-range missile tests now for a year and a half, their program has moved forward in both the number of weapons they have, in both the number of long-range missiles they have, and the sophistication of those. And then you got the Iranians. And we can debate to the end of the earth, right, whether the Iranian nuclear deal was the right deal or not. But even if it wasn't the right deal, pulling out of it was the wrong thing to do, right? And where are we now? We have strengthened the Iranian hardliners. We have weakened the moderates. We have made them more active in the region, more Iranian malign activities in the region. And probably most importantly, they've restarted their nuclear enrichment program. And they've gone from well over a year now in terms of how long it would take them to get to a weapons worth of fissile material to only several months, right? Just by starting to enrich again. And so we're in a worse situation there. So you paint that picture, and terrorism is still around. It hasn't gone away. I actually testified yesterday to the House Homeland Security Committee and said, terrorism is still a threat. And let me emphasize the word still, because I think most people think it's not.
Right.
And so you put all that together, and Mike and I said to each other, this is bigger than what FDR faced. So let's go further back. So we went all the way back till we got to Lincoln, right? Who was facing the prospect of, when he was inaugurated, that most of the South had seceded from the Union, right? So that's where we drew the line and said, this is going to be the most challenging environment a new president has faced since Abraham Lincoln.
Got it. So let's focus on some of these issues. So I want to spend a lot of time on China. So let's start with China, but we will come back to this Iran nuclear deal conversation towards the end. But let's talk about China. So China's looking to pull ahead in a variety of ways, right? They're clearly out there looking to influence our allies, trying to get in and create wedges between us and our allies. You see the border skirmish right now with India, which is low level, no actual weapons, but people have been killed, right? And this is the worst it's been in India, with India since the 80s, if not before that. There hasn't actually been actual deaths on that line of actual control, since the 70s. And so it's obviously very troubling and concerning what's happening there. It shows China getting a little more aggressive. And, you think about Taiwan, and it's, if you had said to me, 5-10 years ago, right, if China comes across the Taiwan Straits, right, would the U.S. be there? And it's hard to debate that issue. Of course we'd be there, right? This has been a precept of our one China theoretical policy, right, since the beginning, right? We've steamed aircraft carriers down Taiwan Straits, dozens of times. And yet today, I think it's a debatable question whether, if China came across the Taiwan Strait tomorrow, not saying they would, right? They did. What will we do? All with COVID going on, the president's views on the use of force. I mean, it's not clear to me, right? We're prepared to go to war with China over Taiwan.
Yeah. So these are great questions. Let me go big picture and then go down. So the big picture is that we are in an intense competition with China over two things. We competed with the Soviet Union over ideology, over nuclear weapons,
right,
and over influence in the world, fought not with economic tools and diplomatic tools, but actually with proxy forces, right? We had proxy wars with the Soviet Union.
Contras, exactly. Right? Afghanistan, right? Yeah.
So the struggle with China is more complicated because we're fighting over two things where they have an awful lot of strength, and you really can't contain them the way we did the Soviet Union. In fact, you can't contain them the way that we did the Soviet Union. So what are those? Those are significant economic competition for the key technologies of the future.
Right.
China China now understands that in order to continue to grow rapidly, they have to move up the value chain. And they have to do that because they are no longer the low wage place on the planet.
Right.
So they've identified those key technologies that Xi Jinping talks about all the time, from artificial intelligence to machine learning to biotechnology. That could go on and on and on.
Right. Quantum.
Well, those are actually the industries that we see, right, as the future of our economy, and the future of our defense systems and the future of our intelligence systems, right?
Right.
So we are in intense competition with them on that issue, and they don't play fairly, right? They subsidize their industries. We don't do that. They steal intellectual property from American companies and give it to their companies. We don't do that. They force technology from American companies who want to do business in China. We don't do that with Chinese companies here. So, the game, that game is not a fair game. And we're also in a situation with China on the economic side, which I should mention, is you hear about this concept of decoupling, right? Decoupling the two economies. And it's really, prior to COVID, it was driven by the national security communities in both countries. Right. So it was driven by the national security community in China that said, whoa, our overall economic growth is too dependent on the United States.
Right.
And boy,
as a market.
as a market, right?
Yeah.
And boy, if anything drove that home to us, it was the last few years of tariffs, right? And the impact that had on us. And we're too dependent on the United States for some key inputs, namely semiconductors. So, and then our national security looked at China and said, whoa, we're too dependent on them for components for weapon systems. So if you tear apart an F-35, right, it's the percentage is classified, but if you tear apart an F-35 and look at the percentage of components that come from China, you'll say, man, that's too high, right? We gotta reduce our dependence. And so both sides want to decouple, right? And so you have that dynamic playing out at the same time as we're having this economic competition. So you have this intense economic competition, and then you have this intense struggle for influence in the world, right? Who can influence what country to do what thing, right?
Yeah.
And you just saw this play out over Huawei and 5G.
Right.
Right? Where we went around the world and we said, hey, don't buy this stuff because it's not secure.
Right? And pretty much failed.
And we failed pretty much everywhere except for a couple
of Australia.
Right?
Yeah.
And they succeeded because they had the money at the end of the day. Right? They had a good product. They subsidized it so it was cheaper. And they have the trade and investment, right, that makes countries sit up and listen.
Yeah.
And one of the really important lessons for me here is that as I think about what created American power over the last 70 and 80 years, certainly the U.S. military played an important role, and the U.S. military's having a global presence, right?
Right.
But that wasn't the only thing, right? It was U.S. trade, it was U.S. direct investment, it was U.S. development assistance, right? It was all of those things too, and now they dominate in those areas, and we don't. So that's why they win things like the Huawei competition. And why does it matter? Somebody might say, why does it matter who wins this influence competition? Yeah. And the answer is because the two countries have completely different approaches to how they use that influence. Our view, based on American exceptionalism, right, is that we raise all boats.
Right.
And in rising all boats, we benefit, right? They don't have that view, right?
They're extractive.
They're America first, right? They're China first, right? And their approach is very narrow. So their idea is, I want to have enough influence in Bangkok or Kuala Lumpur or in Cairo where I can affect the decision-making of those countries as it relates to China issues. That's what they care about. And it all comes back, I think, at the end of the day, to what's in the best interest of the Chinese economy, both in terms of getting the resources they need and, and the markets they need to keep growing. So that's why that influence matters. Back to the region. China does not have territorial ambitions, with a handful of exceptions. And you mentioned two of them, right? That border with India is contested. Taiwan is obviously contested. South China Sea contested. And quite frankly, the border with Vietnam contested. Right?
Interesting.
But that's it. China does not have territorial ambitions, outside of that. Taiwan is the big one. And, I have no doubt that how strongly the Chinese feel about this. And I have no doubt that if Taiwan were to declare independence tomorrow, that the Chinese military would act. And for us, people don't understand this. China has made so many gains militarily in the last 20 years that it wouldn't be a question for us of how we defend Taiwan. It would be a question for us how we would get it back. Because they would win it in 24 to 48 hours.
Oh, right.
We
Absolutely.
could get there.
Right.
So if a president was going to, we don't have an official treaty with Taiwan, but there's an understanding, right, that the United States will come to Taiwan's defense.
Right. And there's legislation and the Taiwan Relations Act and the like, right?
Exactly. So if we wanted to uphold our commitment with regard to Taiwan, you would have to mobilize the country for war against China.
Which is crazy.
it's not only, it's crazy, right? So it's not only a question of would Donald Trump do that, would any president do that?
Right.
I don't know the answer to that question.
Right.
Now, interesting that you raised Taiwan because Sandy Winnefeld, who's another good friend of mine, former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and I just wrote a piece on black swans. Right, the pandemic is a black swan, right? Something that comes out of nowhere. Sometimes you could have imagined it, but you thought it was low probability, and sometimes you can't even imagine these things. But we wrote a piece on black swans, and one of the things we talked about was the possibility of China moving against Taiwan without Taiwan declaring independence.
Right.
And the logic being, Taiwan is moving further away from China every day. The current president of Taiwan is not interested in playing Beijing's game
at all.
The rest of the world is not watching. That's why they feel they can get away with what they're getting away with in Hong Kong, India even, right? So the rest of the world is looking elsewhere. And the model, right? The model that they hoped, that the Chinese hoped that Hong Kong would be for Taiwan, right? One country, two systems. That's gone, right? That's gone.
Yep.
And lastly, the Trump administration, I think it was last week or the week before last, said that they wanted to find ways to deny China semiconductors.
And guess what Taiwan has a lot of?
And guess what Taiwan has a lot of, right? So Graham Allison, who's a good friend of mine at the Harvard Kennedy School, actually wrote a piece about, boy, this sounds a lot to me like the period right before World War II when we denied Japan oil. And it resulted in the attack on Pearl Harbor. So, Sandy and I were speculating about a Chinese move against Taiwan at this moment. And, what would stop them would be the international condemnation. But I wonder how they think about that today, right? They must think that given the world's dependence on them for trade and investment, that at the end of the day, the world might look the other way, right?
Right. As we have with what happened with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, right? As we have with Hong Kong.
Exactly.
As we're going to do with India. You might even imagine that, Hong Kong and India are sort of test cases for the Chinese to see what's the world going to do? Right. Are they even going to pay attention? And truth being, we're not. Particularly with COVID happening right now, it is a sort of very unique environment where even if you were inclined, and you thought you could get the country ginned up to go to war about it or bring the allies together or whatever, or get the UN, without a veto, not saying the Chinese veto in the Security Council, right? With the current cataclysm happening with COVID-19, it's hard to imagine anybody really doing anything, even if they wanted to.
Right. And then so you get to COVID, right? And there's this very interesting story about China with regard to COVID, right?
Yeah.
They are trying to use this to both deflect the criticism that they've received, but they're also doing it to try to increase the influence that they have in the world in this struggle for influence, right? So they're trying to, in part of it is trying to change the narrative from being the place where it started and was initially mismanaged to the place that's
helping everybody.
Managed it really well and is helping everybody else, right? So there's some very effective Chinese diplomacy going on, you can't fault them for. But Chinese leaders, the top Chinese leaders are, making multiple phone calls a day to the leaders of other countries, simply saying, how are you guys doing?
Right.
We're thinking about
what do you need?
What do you need? Right. Yeah. And there are now Chinese doctors and nurses and Chinese personal protective equipment in 120 countries in the world. So basically there is no constraint for China saying no to a country asking for help. And along with that diplomatic initiative is a strategic information initiative that has an overt piece and a covert piece.
Yeah.
And the overt piece is a message of solidarity. It's, we're in this with you and we're here to help you. And a great example of it is the most popular tweet in Italy. I love this story. The most popular tweet in Italy a couple of months ago was from the Chinese embassy in Rome that sends this tweet out, and it has two drawings. The first drawing is is a drawing of Italy helping China in 2008 with a pretty bad earthquake that the Chinese had.
Yeah.
And the other drawing was Chinese doctors and nurses helping Italy today with COVID.
Right.
And the text of the tweet in Italian says, "We will never forget what you did for us, and now we're here for you forever." So that's the overt messaging. The covert.
And this was the most popular tweet in all of Italy.
Yes, for some period of time, right? For some period of time, for a day or two, I don't know how long.
Amazing.
The covert piece, which is more interesting to me, right? So the covert piece, using the same tools that the Russians used against us in 2016, so fake accounts, bots, the whole 9 yards, and not aimed at us, but aimed at the rest of the world, using social media, is number one, the United States of America is responsible for this virus. They created it. They brought it to China. It was a U.S. military officer who brought it to China. They have a whole story about this that they push. The United States of America is not dealing with this effectively. They can't. They're not capable. Their democracy is in tatters. It's not working. It's not a functioning government. So they can't help themselves, let alone help you, and neither can Europe. And that means the EU can't help you and NATO can't help you, right? There's only one country that can help you. So they are doing this very aggressively. It's really the first time that they've done this outside of China. You know, they are big messaging inside, right? Both censorship and propaganda inside. And now they're starting to do this outside. So this is a fundamental change in Chinese behavior brought about by COVID.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So you know, I mentioned that we're going to take. I don't think I mentioned at the top, but we are going to take questions from the audience in about 5 minutes. So I see there's already 7 questions there, folks. Please keep putting your questions in. We'll take as many as we can, starting in about 5 minutes. So you know, is one of our challenges, you know, China seems to frame a lot of the way they see the world in sort of, you know, 100-year millennial increments, right? We look at things. One of the things that makes us so innovative as a country, we look at things in weeks and months and years, maybe a couple of years even, right? We're very rapid to innovate, but we don't think about 10, 15, 50 years, right? Even 20 years like the Russians. I mean, is that part of is that part of the challenge that we're facing with China? And if so, is there a way to turn that to our advantage in the current environment, particularly with COVID-19?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know, I'll start by saying that I had dinner one night with 3 Chinese intelligence officers. You know, CIA talks to everybody, right?
Yeah.
And they were talking about good and bad millennia. They were talking about this good 1,000 years and that bad 1,000 years, right? And I'm sitting there thinking, gosh, you know, our companies think in terms of quarters.
Right.
The government thinks in terms of 4 years or 8 years, right? You know, that is an advantage for them. There's no doubt about it, right? Every CEO will tell you that they're being forced by the markets to focus on the short term is not a healthy thing. Look, we do have some advantages, and we have to take advantage of them.
Yeah.
One is we do have the most innovative and entrepreneurial economy in the world, right? And we don't want to lose that, and that's a huge advantage to us. We do have what I believe to be universal values, right, of democracy and human freedom and human dignity, and I think those things still resonate in the world, and we got to talk about those things, and we have to, you know, we have to put we have to put actions where our mouth is on that, and we have allies. Right, we have allies and partners. They don't. They buy. They buy their influence. Right? Effectively, but if we managed our allies and partners better than we have been, right, we would be in a stronger place. In fact, I think that one of the fundamental pieces to dealing with the Chinese challenge is a coalition of nations. Large coalition, right? TTP, very important. Shouldn't have pulled out of it, but it wasn't big enough. Right? It needs to be TTP plus India, plus Europe, plus you know the major countries in South America and Latin America. We need to present a united front to China and say to them, "Look, we'll all give you more room to, have influence in the world as long as you live by the rules of the international order. And if you don't, right, we're all going to push back really hard on you.
Right.
The problem with that is the clock is ticking.
Yeah.
It really is. The clock is ticking. And we're running out of time. And, we gotta move quickly on that front, or we're going to be in trouble.
Right. Part of the problem is, I think a lot of us, Democrats and Republicans alike, I think, believe that economic liberalism would bring sort of that change to Chinese behavior, both in the region but also at home, right? That they would sort of start to respect human rights and start to come around on those issues. And that theory has been a complete fail. To the contrary, we've engaged heavily with them economically, and they've modernized economically, but they've managed to continue their sort of bad behavior at home and bad behavior in the region, and we've looked the other way, right? Yeah. And so to them, it almost looks like this has actually worked out for them as well as could be, and we're more tied to them. So it's hard for us to decouple in any real sense of the word. How does that fact affect? Well, one, is that right? And Sue, if it is right, how does that affect the dynamic between us and them going forward?
So we're every day we are in a weaker position, and every day we're forcing countries in the world to at least think about whether they have to make a choice or not. So as you mentioned, I spent the first 15 years of my career doing East Asia, and I still spend a lot of time there, and I still talk to a lot of people there.
Yeah.
And the number one question I get is, are we going to have to make a choice between our security relationship with you and our economic relationship with China? And what I tell them is on my spectrum, right? If we end up down at the left side where have some cooperation and healthy competition with China, you won't have to make a choice. But if we end up at the other end of the spectrum, unhealthy competition and confrontation and possibly conflict, yeah, you're going to have to make a choice. And I was in this fascinating conversation not long ago with 3 former diplomats, one from Singapore, one from Malaysia, and one from Thailand. We were talking about this. And the guy from Singapore said to me, Michael, really important that you understand 3 things. Number one, every country in Asia wants to be a friend of the United States. Number 2, no country in Asia wants to be an enemy of China. Number 3, and this is what you really need to know, if we ever have to make a choice between those 2 things, being a friend of you and versus not being a friend of China, the choice is going to be easy for us because of who we're dependent on economically and where we live geographically. That's pretty powerful. And I believe he's right.
So put to the choice, we're not the winners of that debate.
No, we're not.
Wow. Yeah.
We're not. So we got to get our act together.
Well, let me turn to questions from the audience. I mean, this is a fascinating conversation. We could go on for hours, but we've got 12 questions in. So let me just start going through some of them. So Jeremy Kahn asked, one of our visiting fellows at NSI, how do you see the COVID-19 pandemic impacting our collection against hard targets? And how do you see it impacting their collection against us? I mean, obviously, officers aren't getting out, right? Wherever they are around the world, or at least have limited how much they're getting out and being able to interact with assets. How do you see that playing out, particularly with hard target nations?
Yeah, so I got to be careful here. I got to be careful here what I say. So let me just say this. Currently existing assets have ways of communicating with us that don't require in-person meetings.
Right.
So I don't know, but I would bet that collection by current assets has not been affected that much.
Interesting.
Now, maybe some of those people aren't going to work anymore.
Right. So they're not getting information, right?
They're not getting information. Maybe they're in week on, week off kind of thing, right? Maybe they're working from home, right? And
blue gold, right?
So who knows on that front? I think the bigger impact is on recruiting, spotting and developing and assessing, right, and recruiting new assets that do require in-person meetings. So I bet you that is where the impact is.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Harold Moss asks, China and Russia have been focused on accelerating innovation, right? While we in the U.S. are maybe putting a declining emphasis on that. one, do you agree? And second, how do you see, if that's right, how do you see that shift affecting overall national security? And will that affect our strategic balance of power, this issue about them really doubling down on innovation, us sort of maybe, if we are really pulling our foot off the accelerator?
So I would challenge the premise that our capabilities at innovation are declining. I spend a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and I'm blown away by the creativity, entrepreneurship, and innovation. So, I obviously didn't see into that world prior to 2013, but I have not seen any decline in the last 7 years, where I've spent quite a bit of time there. I think we are still, as I said earlier, the most innovative and entrepreneurial country on the planet. Now, it is absolutely true. I do agree with the precedent, with the predicate that the Chinese are getting much better at innovation, and I don't think people in general realize that. Yeah. And I do think the competition for these key technologies is absolutely critical. So quantum, as you know, quantum computing.
Yeah.
Absolutely critical to encryption and the ability to decrypt, right? I think AI is absolutely critical to the future of weapon systems and intelligence systems. So, who gets there first matters a lot. And, they have some significant advantages. And I really think, I don't know, I'm not a domestic guy, but I think we need to think about how our government interacts with our private sector with regard to those key technologies and what help we can provide it, at least at the kind of developmental, right, the R&D stage, right? Maybe there should be significant government money, at the R&D stage, particularly to universities, but even to some private companies. I think we really got to think about how we do a better job competing with China, because they're not going to stop doing what they do. So how do we better position ourselves? And the final point I'd make here is so much, right? One problem we have is figuring out a strategy for dealing with China. And I feel like we're kind of waiting for the George Tenet moment, right? Where somebody writes, here's how to think about this place, and here's what we have to do. I think we're still waiting for that. But that's only half our problem, and maybe less than half our problem. Our other problem is we are weaker domestically at home, right? From a political and particularly a political perspective, but a social perspective and an economic perspective. And if we're gonna win this struggle, this competition with China, that is a necessary condition for success, is that we get our act together politically, socially, and economically here, or there's no way the best strategy is going to be able to win.
Yeah, because they'll also be able to exploit those divisions, as you pointed out, as the Russians have, and as they are doing already today. That is a real challenge. You're absolutely right. So Olivia Wee asks, whether President Trump's decision to reduce troops in Germany and forward deploy them to other parts of Eastern Europe, and the Indo-Pacific, is that a good idea, bad idea, indifferent? Should we be taking a different strategy? What's your thinking there?
I think it's. I don't think it was done for strategic reasons. I think it was done for political reasons. I think there's such dislike of Angela Merkel that's why it was done. I don't think there was a National Security Council well thought out strategy for it makes sense for us to reduce troops in Germany for the following reasons, and it makes better sense to put them over here for the following reasons. I think it was, as we've learned from John Bolton's book, and I don't know who's read the book yet, I have, as we've read in John Bolton's book, these are off-the-cuff decisions by the president, right? These aren't, there's no process here.
Yeah.
No process for coming to a decision like that. So I think that's probably a political decision because he didn't like it.
Yeah. So Michael, Abraham Kang asks, if China requires companies to share technology when they do business in China, as we know they do, this extractive approach they take, requiring you to do joint ventures and the like, why don't we require reciprocity. Just do the same here. You Chinese companies here come to the United States, right? You've got to partner with IBM or Google or name your company, and you're gonna have to give us your IP. Why not do the same on this side?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and look, I think everything is on the table. I think we should discuss all of these things. But having said that, I do think that we want to be very careful that we don't start doing things that undermine our own values and our own principles that made us who we are and created the great nation that we are. So, for example, I would be strongly against doing to other countries what the Russians have done to us. Because A, I don't think it would be effective, but B, I don't think that we have any leg to stand on in complaining about one country doing it to us if we're doing it to other countries.
Yeah.
And we live in the biggest glass house, right? We live in the biggest democracy. So I really think we got to be careful about going down that road. But given the challenges that China poses to us, I think everything is on the table for discussion.
Yeah. So Nicholas Shimovic, who I know you know well, also here with us at NSI in part, asked about the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, and he asked whether it's doomed because of Huawei, or any other reason. Do we think Five Eyes is on its back heel? Obviously, we've seen the British have taken a different view of the situation than we have. Are there reasons to worry about Five Eyes?
So no, I don't think so. So I actually think that I'm probably going to get in trouble here, but I actually don't think that the argument that we used against Huawei was the best one.
Interesting.
We used the argument that Huawei could have put a back door in, right? That the Chinese intelligence services could then use. I happen to know what our capabilities are in that regard, right? We don't need a back door. We can go right through the front door, right? From an intelligence perspective. I think the danger of Huawei is two things. I think the danger relates to Chinese military access to critical infrastructure, which I worry about, right? And their ability to attack it in a time of war. So I worry about that. And I worry about...
To take it down, you mean? To take it down if they need to.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I worry about the supply chain consequences of being dependent on China, right? Because you don't just buy... You just don't buy 5G here. You buy support, you buy replacement parts, you buy updates, software updates, right? You buy all of that. And boy, you become dependent on them for a really important part of your economy. Yeah. So I think we use the wrong argument, right? So I don't think it's going to affect our intelligence relationships, number one. And the other thing I'd say about the Five Eyes, and again, I'll probably get myself in trouble here, is intelligence relationships are really bilateral, right? Because they're based on trust. So, and the more people you get in the room, the less overall trust there is, right? Just because the points of connection grow, at such a rapid rate, exponentially, right? So that's why intelligence services are much more comfortable bilaterally than they are in any multilateral setting. So, there are a handful of things that are shared among all Five Eyes nations, but the most sensitive things are shared bilaterally.
Even within the Five Eyes.
Even within the Five Eyes.
Yeah, interesting. So I know we only have about 8 minutes left, and we are going to end on time, folks. So, I'm going to get a few more questions in. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Michael, for being here. This has been great. So David Priest, who again I know you also know, asked about, he's got a question about Africa, right? So he wants to know, as Africa continues to rise in so many different ways, right, it often still remains left out of a lot of these national security conversations, despite the fact that there's an overlap in the competition with China. I was in Africa back in 2011, 2012. They're building parliament buildings all over the place, including strategically important places to us. How can U.S. national security leaders best engage Africa, David asks, and strategically, particularly to bolster our U.S. national security?
Yeah, so we have to pay attention to it, right? So I was deputy director for 3.5, almost 4 years. I don't think I ever went to a deputies committee meeting that looked at Africa as a whole and talked about and talked about an overall strategic approach to the continent, right, and to the three most important countries: South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria, and how to think about where we wanted, what we wanted to achieve in terms of our relationship, and the best strategy to get there, and which organizations should do what in the U.S. government to make that happen. So I think you got to pay attention, right? You got to put priority on it. And, I think that Nick is right, or David's right. I think we have to, it is a place of competition. We paid more attention to it during the Cold War when we were fighting proxy wars against the Soviets, and we got to start paying attention to it again for the same reason.
Yeah. Question with the last name Lewis asks, given the many challenges the war presents, how can the U.S. deal with them diplomatically when the State Department has been gutted, right? When most of our experienced, most knowledgeable diplomats have been gone, have left, whether because of personal reasons or disagreements with the administration or just timing. We've lost a deep bench, right? How do we deal with that challenge from a diplomatic perspective?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that Mike Vickers and I talked about in our piece that we had in the Post on the world that Joe Biden would inherit is. It's going to inherit a pretty weak toolkit, right, for dealing with the world. And, for me, there's, 4 legs to the kind of national security toolkit. One is defense, one is intelligence, one is diplomacy, and one is developmental assistance. You could put that together with diplomacy, I guess. But by far the weakest is diplomacy. And it's not just, it's unfair just to blame this administration. This goes back 10, 20 years, the lack of investment in the State Department, in the Foreign Service, in diplomacy, has now come home to roost. And, it's interesting. I can think of diplomats who I grew up with, right, when I was a young analyst, whose names were known, across America, and that just doesn't exist today. I mean, they were real experts, deep experts on the world, and people listen to what they have to say, and we've lost that. And the piece of the toolkit that needs the most work is diplomacy. They need significant new investment. It's not true of the intelligence community and DoD. They have other problems that need to be fixed, but money is not, a substantial amount of money is not one of them, but the State Department needs a substantial amount of money.
So just to follow on to that, so obviously we also have challenges in the intelligence community, right? We have an intelligence community that's been under significant stress in the last few years. Talk to us about how that affects this dynamic.
So I think the intelligence community has a handful of challenges. Number one is we have to get back to the intelligence community being free from political pressure, actually being objective, right? I mean, I have some concerns about that. And that fixing that piece of it, fixing the objectivity piece of it, out of politics, not part of politics, no political pressure, all of that's got to be fixed. There's got to be an understanding between a president and his or her DNI and his or her director of CIA that they're going to get some bad news, and they're going to have to just suck it up and take it. And that it's important for the leadership of the intelligence community to be out publicly talking about what the intelligence community does, why it does it, what its successes are, what its failures are. And when they do that, sometimes, Mr. President, we're going to say things that you're not going to like. And that's the way this relationship has to work. That, right? So that has to be fixed. It's very important, probably the most important thing. The second thing that has to be fixed is there needs to be a shift of focus, right? And I don't want to use CT as a bill player, right? I don't want to significantly impact counterterrorism, but there's got to be a shift in resources away from counterterrorism and towards the peer and near peer competitors, and
Right.
in new areas, right? I'm not talking about understanding Chinese politics and foreign policy. I'm talking about understanding how countries use information operations,
Right.
and being able to see those before they come, right? And thinking about how do you counter those. And those key industries of the future, I want to have analysts who understand where China is on AI,
Yeah.
just as well as I have analysts who understand where Iran is on its nuclear weapons program, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work to be done in that area. And then the third thing I'd say is, and this is true both of DoD and the intelligence community, they are not at the cutting edge of technology.
Yeah.
They're not. And technology is moving so fast that they're getting further away from where they're supposed to be. So the intelligence community has got to figure out, and this is a problem for the leadership of the entire community, they got to figure out how to get to the cutting edge and stay there, and how to stay there, because technology is not going to stop. Right? These very, very long procurements for major systems, both in DoD and in the intelligence community, are killers, because by the time the system is delivered, you're behind the curve, way behind the curve.
Right.
So there's not been enough attention paid to that. So there's absolutely work to be done in the intelligence community. I'd say the main work to be done at DoD is, you know, this whole concept of ways, ends, and means, right? And how you have to fit all those together. DoD's got to rethink the means, right? If you talk to guys in the Air Force, they only think about the number of planes. Guys talk to guys in the Navy, they think about the number of ships. You talk to guys in the Army, they think about the number of troops that they have. That's how they measure themselves.
Yeah.
And they're used to fighting in certain ways, and they really are going to have to start thinking through new ways of fighting, because the additional means aren't going to be there. And that's exactly what the Russians and Chinese did for the last 20 years. Rethought warfare, right? And that's why they're capable of taking Taiwan in 24 to 48 hours and us not being able to stop it.
Right.
That's
a great point. That's a great point. Michael, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it. We kept the whole audience even a minute past. Thank you so much. Folks, join us in 2 weeks from now for Lisa Monaco, NSI Advisory Board member and former White House Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor, Tuesday, July 7th at 5 p.m. Stick around right after this. There'll be a survey. Let us know what you think. Sign up for the whole series. And follow us on Twitter at Mason NatSec. Michael, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Amazing conversation.
All right, take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good night. Yeah, bye.